Leah for 64K and welcome to my latest mini documentary.
Welcome to 64K, hosted by Bastish B.
And welcome back. So in today's episode we're going to be having a look at all the Robocop games on the Commodore 64. But before we do that, let's take a quick little look at the franchise itself. Robocop is a movie franchise that started its violent satirical life back in 1987 with the release of the first movie by Orion Pictures. It starred Peter Buckaroo Banzai himself, Weller.
Hey now. Don't be mean. We don't have to be mean. Because, remember, no matter where you go, there you are. Miguel, I usually play a sleazebag for rare, and Kurtwood Red Smith.
The reason that bad things happen to you is because you're a dumbass.
The movie was very successful and kicked off the franchise, being followed by 1990's fun but flawed sequel, Robocop 2.
Take it over, creep.
And the nail in the coffin, there was the dismal attempt at movie making, 1993's Robocop 3.
You may want to call the fire department.
As per usual with franchises, the content has been up and down for over 3 decades, with toys, comics, and of course games being released sporadically over the years, covering arcades, consoles, computers, to varying degrees of success. We also got 2 cartoon series, Robocop the animated series, which I watched as a kid and quite enjoyed. It only lasted 12 episodes and debuted in 1988 between the first 2 movies. Another series was also made in 1998 called Robocop Alpha Commando, which I honestly never even knew existed until making this video, and comprised of 40 episodes in total. We also got 2 kind of mediocre TV series, one from 1994 and another from 2001, which are actually much better than Robocop 3 movie, but that's not saying much.
Central. Disregard.
No unnecessary violence, do you hear me?
And fast forward to the year 2014 with the inevitable modern reboot simply entitled Robocop. Obviously meant just to confuse the consumer into buying this piece of trash on Amazon when you actually thought you were buying the 1987 version. It was PG-13. Didn't we learn anything from the disaster that was Robocop 3? I digress. So today we'll be jumping into all the Commodore 64 games and looking in more detail into the movies that inspired them. So I've also got a few other episodes out in the series so far. I got one about James Bond, 2080 comics, DC comics, and Ghostbusters. So if you like this one, please check those out. Okay, so now let's start checking out all those games. And on today's episode, we're going to look at all 3 Robocop games on the Commodore 64, starting with 1989's Robocop, 1990's Robocop 2, and 1992's Robocop 3, all published by Ocean. So let's jump on over to the first game. Our first game for today was released in 1989 by Ocean and was loosely based on the 1988 Data East arcade game. But before we continue, let's check out the movie that inspired both of them. 1987 saw the release of Robocop by Orion Pictures hit the theaters and become one of the sleeper hits of the year. The movie about a cop, Alex Murphy, who gets brutally gunned down on a line of duty and is brought back to life by the sketchy corporation OCP as Robocop. Part man, part machine, all cop. The movie was directed by Dutch filmmaker Paul Verhoeven, who brought all his ultra-violence and black humor to the forefront for this brilliant piece of sci-fi satire.
I'd buy that for $1.
Verhoeven would replicate this formula brilliantly in 2 other movies that are well worth watching, 1990's Total Recall,
Get your ass to Moss.
and 1997's Starship Troopers.
Everyone fights, no one quits. You don't do your job, I'll shoot you.
The movie manages to combine dark themes about the human condition,
Can you do that, Dad?
hilarious parodies about 80s social life,
Red alert, red alert, red alert.
You crossed my line of death.
You haven't dismantled your MX stockpile.
Pakistan is threatening my border.
That's it, Buster. No more military aid.
Nuke 'em. Get them before they get you. Another quality home game from Butler Brothers.
as well as being a roller coaster of a ride of an action movie. These are things that shouldn't really work that well together, but it's all pulled off brilliantly.
The movie was made for a paltry sum of $13 million and made $53 million back in its initial theatrical run. It became even more popular in 1988 with the VHS release, which cemented its status amongst the sci-fi classics. 88 was also the year we saw the release of the Data East arcade version of the movie, which turned out to be quite an excellent side-scrolling run-and-gun affair, which the Ocean port is loosely based on. And this all brings us back to 1989's Commodore 64 version, which does have elements and levels from the arcade, but also lots of other differences and minigames added to the mix. It follows the classic Ocean movie formula model, which revolves around side-scrolling run-and-gun stages interspersed with minigames between levels. The C64 version is pretty good with some really fantastic music by Jonathan Dunn, an Ocean music veteran at that point, and some nice looking high-res graphics, and on all the minigames which are based on pieces of the movie, including shooting the rapey punk in the alley,
Your move, creep.
trying to identify criminals on the computer, and blasting good old Dick Jones at the end of the game. This review is based on the 2015 Commodore 64 Cracking Group Nostalgia's bug-fixed version, which corrects all of Ocean's sloppy programming on the later levels of the game, which were severely bugged in graphics, making it almost impossible to finish. I'll leave a link in the video description so you can get this version, which is how it should have been released in the first place. Zap64 gave the game a massive 89% in a 1989 issue. Clearly they didn't play it all the way to the end though. But nevertheless, this is a pretty solid movie license game that takes elements from the arcade and its own unique features and mashes it all together in a well-presented package. Next up was the inevitable movie sequel, Robocop 2, released in 1990 by Orion Pictures once again. This time we see Robo trying to take out the nuke drug epidemic that is ravaging old Detroit, at the same time trying to take down OCP's new corrupt Robocop 2 model that is out to replace the old tin can himself. The movie was directed by veteran Irvin Kershner, who is probably most well known for directing the excellent Empire Strikes Back, and also the kind of rubbish Never Say Never Again. But fortunately this one turned out to be a pretty fun sequel, at least in my opinion.
Take it over, creep.
Is it as good as the original? Well, no. But taken on its own account, it has tons of great and some really great action sequences as well as set pieces. You do lose some of that human condition aspect that made the original so special, but as a pure standalone fun popcorn version, this one I feel gets unfairly slammed, and I've always enjoyed it quite a bit. It was written by comic legend Frank Miller of Sin City and Dark Knight fame, and even though his original script was altered quite heavily, it's still quite a fun ride. If you want to see what Frank's unedited Robocop 2 would have been like, he made it into graphic novel form in 2013 and is a pretty damn good read. At the end of the day, the movie grossed $45 million in theaters and an extra $22 million in VHS rentals, and managed to keep Orion afloat even though the writing was already on the wall for that film company. The C64 version this time has nothing to do with the second Data East arcade game, which was only released in 1991, and this one is a totally original game by Ocean. This 1990 release, for me anyway, seems like Ocean were really trying very hard to imitate the console games at the time, and this Commodore 64 version always felt and looked a lot like an NES game to me, meaning it's platform shooting action with really different, for at least a C64 game, color palette, which looks very Nintendo-esque. As far as the game goes, it uses the movie as a basis and doesn't try to replicate scenes like the original. It's all side-scrolling platform jumping and running gun action gameplay all the way through. The objective, just like the movie, is to eradicate the nuke epidemic in Detroit by blasting all the drug dealers and finding all the nuke in every stage. The stages themselves are pretty varied and replicate some of the scenes from the movie. The graphics are big and bold and animated quite well. Music again is also by Jonathan Dunn, and while not as good as the original, is still a pretty decent toe tapper. This game is a pretty good Nintendo style platformer with a massive 20 levels in it, but it does have a few annoying issues, like Robo's weird sliding effect, like he's always walking in an ice rink, and the fact that if you miss picking up some nuke, the screen won't roll back so you can't get it, which makes planning how to get the next vial all that more critical. Zap64 gave the game 90% overall, which I feel is a little bit much, but it was definitely a unique looking and playing game on the C64, at least in 1990, so that might be the reason for the high rating. This game is nothing like the original at all, and it's its own weird little game that is pretty good overall, but some of those flaws I mentioned may be a deal breaker for anybody that's easily frustrated while gaming. And now we move on to the cinematic nightmare that was Robocop 3, released in 1993, and the final film also put out by Orion Pictures. The movie was directed by Fred Dekker, who did a real classic in the movie The Monster Squad, and also Night of the Creeps is a great underrated 80s gem as well. However, this one is nowhere near the quality of either of those, unfortunately. The movie was co-written by Dekker and Frank Miller, who was back again, and a lot of the story elements, acts from Miller's original Robocop 2 script make a return to this film. We see OCP buying Detroit outright and going ahead by building the new Delta City, which was set up in the original movie. To do this though, they have to forcibly relocate in a not very nice manner. The lower class citizens of Detroit, and things just go from bad to worse.
Now the system's out to get him, because he's fighting for the people.
Overall, the plot of this movie is actually pretty cool. It's simply everything else that just falls apart as soon as the movie starts. Making it PG-13 was the biggest mistake.
You have the right to remain silent.
And a complete nail in the coffin for me, as we get countless scenes of Robo shooting guns out of people's hands. It just feels weird. Just like in every episode of G.I. Joe I watched as a kid, as a Cobra soldier's plane or helicopter is about to get hit, he jumps out to safety, which is fine for a cartoon, but not for Robocop, damn you. Peter Weller didn't return this time, as he was shooting Naked Lunch with David Cronenberg, so he really lucked out on this big old debacle. Orion Pictures literally went bankrupt halfway through production, and the movie was put into limbo. It was supposed to come out in 1992 but got pushed back to 93, and most importantly, it just doesn't have any of that wit and charm of the first two at all. The only good thing I can possibly say about this movie is they got Basil Poledouris back for the score, and he again does an excellent job just like he did in the original, and it dramatically helps out the movie tremendously in the atmosphere department.
In 15 seconds, everything within 20 yards of where we're standing will be atomized. We're dead, you stupid slag!
When it was all said and done, it only grossed $10 million worldwide on a $22 million budget, and pretty much ended Orion Pictures for good. So with that, you're probably thinking, Ocean's 1992 release of Robocop 3 was gonna be a massive piece of garbage. Well, it's not. In fact, the Commodore version at least is probably my favorite of the Robocop games on the C64. First off, it follows the plot of the movie in an overall way similar to 2, with a few set pieces from the movie, including the ninja robot fights and the jetpack tank sequence. For the most part though, it's a side-scrolling running gun, pretty much like the first game, with a few variations like the Operation Wolf first level, where you just mow down punks like no tomorrow from a first-person view, and the really well-implemented jetpack stage where you blast more OCP stooges with a variation on the running gun style. The graphics are really good and varied, and were done by veteran Hugh Riley of The Last Ninja fame, and the music is excellent, provided by Sid legend Jerome Tell, with the opening track being even better than Jonathan Dunn's original gem. It only has 5 levels, which is way less than the second game, but each one is crafted to a really high quality. Probe did the honors of the C64 version this time, coming off a run of brilliant Commodore games like Supremacy, Outrun Europa and Smash TV, amongst many others, and definitely delivered Ocean the most well put together Robocop game out of the C64 trilogy. This game for me is my favorite of the series. Its combination of gameplay variety, graphics, and absolutely rocking music just makes it feel the best of the series, with Zap 64 giving it an overall 92% in the March 1992 issue, citing presentation, sound, and hookability being its best features. If you missed this one because of the late C64 release, I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's a well-made game and a great way to end the Robo series on the C64.
So how do the Robocop games fare up on the Commodore 64? Well, I think they fare up pretty damn good. I mean, compared to the other series I've done, which are all over the place, this is probably the most consistent. I think all 3 games are quite good. They all have their own pluses and minuses, some are better than others, but overall there's not really a bad game here. The original one, the first one here, is still a pretty cool game. It's sort of a conversion of the Dead East arcade game. It's a little bit of a mix. I think it's a pretty good running gun action game. I like all the mini games that are thrown in between. It definitely gives the game a little bit of variety. Like I said in the review, check out the nostalgia version. I got in the link. That gives you access to like all the levels. You know, the original one was bugged, so you can see the game all the way to the end, and there's some really cool levels later on, especially in the OCP building. It's a really solid entry. As for number 2, 2 is such a weird game. It's kind of like its own weird Nintendo kind of thing. I mean, the Nintendo version is also exactly the same. The Commodore version was obviously modeled after that, or they decided to make one version that would fit all kind of computers and consoles at the time, even though a lot of the other computer versions of Robocop 2 are completely different. The Commodore and the NES one are the same, they're the same game. Just obviously look a little bit different, sound a little bit different, but they're exactly the same game still. Gameplay and the levels and all that kind of stuff. It's definitely it definitely feels like kind of a weird game on the Commodore 64. It does have its flaws, number 2. There's no doubt about it. There's some little niggles here and there. It is kind of difficult sometimes, certain levels. Overall, it's still a decent game that's worth checking out. And as for number 3, I personally feel that this is the best one. I think they managed to get everything right. The running gun style of gameplay works really well. Robo's a little bit slow, but Robo is slow anyway. But it's a little bit more, I think the graphics and everything is a little bit more detailed. The music is top notch, it's just perfect, Jerome Tell as usual. The levels set out and the design are really good. I like the variety as well. I think the third one for me personally is the best of the bunch, although I think they're all quite good. The third one definitely takes the cake. And that's it from me, Bastish-B at 64K. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please check out my other videos. I got lots of different series, lots of different videos on all subjects, all retro gaming related. So please check them out. If you can like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.